right. Well, Rick, do you want to get us started?
I would love to get you started. First of all, good evening. Thank you. And I thank you for having me back, and welcome to the second annual STEMtember. I was at the first one. How about that? That's when we still appear in person and do these things rather than have to do it virtually. I am Rick Corey from KRMG 1023 KRMG, Tulsa's News and Talk. I'm from the KRMG Morning News. My co-host there is Dan Potter, but my co-host tonight is Megan McClellan, from meteorologist from Fox23. We're both big supporters of educators. I think educators are heroes. Trust me, I absolutely believe that. And we are big supporters of STEM as well. As a matter of fact, it probably helped lead Megan to her career, right, Megan?
It absolutely did. I have loved everything STEM since I was little, and it just continued to lead me to where I am today. So STEM is definitely a big part of my life. We want to thank all of you for joining us for an evening of networking, curriculum, enrichment, and appreciation. While, of course, we would love to have wine and dined you all in person, we appreciate you giving us your time and joining us on the computers. I know over the last 6 months, a lot of us have spent a lot of time in front of our computers, so we appreciate you spending more time with us.
I would like to say that had we thought this through ahead of time, we could have delivered the wine. But, you know, I'm just saying that's one.
We should have done that.
There are a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, we are recording this webinar, and the team at the Tulsa Regional STEM Alliance will send out a link to all the registered users and participants, and that'll happen tomorrow. So in case you miss anything, you're going to have the opportunity to rewatch it and share the experience with some other people, some other colleagues who I'm sure will find it valuable.
And of course, it wouldn't be an appreciation event without some giveaways. I know a lot of people are excited about that. We want to thank many of our partners that we've gotten door prizes that we will be giving away at the end of the evening. All you'll have to do to enter those is text a code for the door prize that you're interested in to 70123. That's the magical number that you're going to text to. We're also going to be sharing a link in the chat now with the information about the prizes and the codes that you are going to use to enter. The 25th texter for each of those prizes will be the winner, and you'll receive a confirmation text with details about how to claim your prize. On top of that, we also have goodie bags for the first 100 teachers to complete the post-event survey. We're going to share that link a little bit later and in the email that goes out tomorrow. Included in the bag are many resources, including a book pertaining to the important topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the classroom, a couple of self-care items, and a $10 gift card donated by Quick Trip.
You had me when I thought you said mini Reese's, and I thought Reese's. I thought maybe we had mini Reese's. Then I want a bag. All right, but thank you. That's cool. We know that teaching is one of the most challenging and respected career choices, and there's no question it's more challenging now than it's ever been for at home or at school or a mix thereof. It's vital to social, cultural, and economic health of the nation, and we're finding that out more so during this pandemic. Now, today, the seeds of that dramatic transformation in education are being planted as we move people forward. So leading the way are all the thousands of teachers who are not just doing their job, but they're rethinking how it's done, and especially, again, right now. Relationships with students, with colleagues, the community, the tools and techniques they enjoy and sometimes have to go find on their own. The rights and responsibilities, all that is part of what we're doing. And we want to assess whether they're being met with preparation in teachers and the ongoing professional development, and that's got to be important too, continue learning. I'm a dive instructor, and I know when I became an instructor, the very first thing the guy who certified me said was, congratulations, you're at the bottom of the rung. You need to keep learning. And that's what we're all trying to do. Even if we're teaching school, we're trying to learn in school too. Teachers are reinventing themselves and their occupations and doing all that, nothing short of, I think, just being superheroes.
This program is one of many in our STEMtember lineup of programming. Cox Media Group is a proud partner with the Tulsa Regional STEM Alliance to bring the entire month of September to celebrate STEM in the Tulsa area. I do want to take a moment to introduce Exanne Black. She is the executive director of this great organization, and she's going to talk a little bit about the Alliance and what resources they have to offer.
Thank you, Megan. So you guys may have missed this little news bit with all the facts and figures you've been hearing about COVID, but it really turns out that the devil whispered to 2020 teachers, "You're not strong enough to withstand this storm, YOUR." And the teachers whispered back, YOU''RE. So that funny little story reflects just one of the things that we love about you, our heroes and our educators. In the middle of this perfect storm of global pandemic, remote learning, wildfires, economic crisis, toilet paper shortages, and Zoom purgatory, we can look around the proverbial room and see the calm, cool, trustworthy, okay, maybe dark circled eyes of our teachers. Through this unimaginable storm, you have been rock steady, eye on the prize, service above self role models that our world, our children, our families, and our community so desperately need right now. We understand that you too are worried. You are also weary, and you're manifesting a courage that helps the rest of us relocate our own courage. Tonight we celebrate and just flat out cheer for you. Imagine all of us, especially Rick, with pom-poms, pots, pans, kettle drums, kazoos, and noisemakers, sending up the biggest shout you've ever heard in your life. That's what's in our hearts and in our heads when we think about you, our teachers. That's what tonight's T.D. Williamson Teachers Night is all about. And guess what? The party doesn't stop tonight. Thanks to our friends at Kendra Scott, when you shop there this Friday or Saturday and use the discount code GiveBack9214, 20% of your purchase will go toward TRSA thanks to the Kendra Gives Back program. Then we will take our magic STEM fairy wand and turn those proceeds into Kendra Scott gift cards for as many teachers as possible who are participating in our event tonight. And we want to say thanks again to our incredible partners like Cox Media Group and T.D. Williamson that are making tonight possible. Back to Megan.
Well, Exanne kind of took my next little thunder of thanking T.D. Williamson, but they are our title sponsor for tonight. And this event honestly would not be possible without them. And we have to thank them so much for this and for providing goodie bags for our educators that we have with us tonight.
And Megan knows, don't challenge me. I will put on the cheerleading skirt. It'll happen.
And it's a great show, y'all.
it would, I don't know about that, but it could happen. All right, and right now we want to introduce you to somebody. And it is our honor to introduce you to Annie Tomacek, T.D. Williamson Community Relations. You're going to share a bit about the work and why the event is important to them.
Thank you so much, Rick. At T.D. Williamson, we know it's a great honor to support education, and especially our teachers. More than the glue that holds our society together, you are the force that moves us forward. My grandfather, T.D. Jr., a proud Central High School graduate, was a huge proponent of education, as was his father, T.D. Sr. Both of them were engineers, and it's because of a simple but transformative invention created by T.D. Sr. that our company was founded 100 years ago and still exists today. Teachers inspired both men to think critically and turn innovative ideas into practical solutions, to not only dream it, but also to give them the tools to make those dreams a reality. That's what teachers do. When my grandfather was forced to drop out of college to help his father with the business during the Depression, he knew he would return someday to get his engineering degree. When he did, and the company became successful, he vowed to commit himself to a life of philanthropy and mentorship. TD said, "We can never pay back. We must always pay forward." During these times of a pandemic and economic uncertainty, our teachers face more challenges than ever before, yet you have never been more needed. It's no secret that diversity, equity, and inclusion have always been a part of a teacher's daily focus, and it's about time that the community, especially business and industry, made it known that we stand shoulder to shoulder with you in these efforts. The American dream is ultimately one of an inclusive society, but to make that happen, we need to provide resources and supports, have conversations, listen. Yesterday, I had the honor of attending a virtual awards ceremony of a wonderful organization we support in Atlanta that honors exceptional young students in the arts, literature, sports, technology, and community service. It was amazing to see children of every demographic, race, ethnicity, economic group, receiving awards for excellence. These children are our future. I was also surprised to see that the celebration included a video commendation from the late and great civil rights champion, Congressman John Lewis, reminding these children that they are the voices of the future and that we should lift all voices. So thank you, teachers, for the work you do in inspiring students and families to be their best. You truly make this world a better place.
Thank you, Annie. And that's tremendous to hear. What a great backstory of a family right there and carrying that family forward. You can't do something like this without other community partners involved. We want to thank several. Some I'm very familiar with, like Oklahoma Central Credit Union, a personal sponsor of mine, Academy Sports and Outdoors. Who doesn't like going there, huh? BMX Foundation and Papa Murphy's.
And we could all use some pizza sometimes, but
Yeah.
with racial and cultural diversity are hallmarks of our society. And to celebrate this diversity and cultivate harmony and respect for all peoples, educators must nurture equality and inclusion within the classroom.
So to help us better understand how we can all elevate the important all voices in our classrooms, we want to have a more exclusive experience for students. We've gathered an esteemed panel here tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce them. One is Dr. Laura Lauda, the Director of Post-Secondary Partnership and Research at Impact Tulsa. She holds a PhD in Instructional Leadership and Academic Curriculum from the University of Oklahoma. She is STEM focused, and her dissertation entitled Evaluating the Effects of STEM Out of School Time Programming on the Development of STEM and the 21st Century Skills of Community School Students. Now, prior to joining Impact Tulsa, she also worked 7 years as an educator and administrator at Union Public Schools District in Tulsa. 3 Union lifers in my house, just so you'll know, right? Dr. Lauda also serves as the adjunct professor leading math concepts for education at OU Tulsa.
Our next panelist is Dr. Duane Dickens. He is the Director of Cultural Responsive Practices for Tulsa Community College. It's a position to support students' success. Through his office, students are assisted with their use of research-based study strategies, leadership development, and balancing of life concerns through success coaching. Dr. Dickens has also served as a developmental English associate professor at TCC for over 18 years. Dr. Dickens is active in social justice issues throughout the region, reflected in his work with several social justice organizations in our area, such as the John Hope Franklin Center of Reconciliation, the Greater Tulsa African American Affairs Commission, the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice, Racism Stinks, and Oklahoma Humanities, along with serving as a board member for KIPP, Tulsa College Preparatory.
Also with us is Dr. Jennifer Miller, the Academic Content Manager of Secondary Science for Tulsa Public Schools. Her career as an educator began back in 2006. It's taken her across the world to teach secondary education in Istanbul, in Seoul, in Kuwait, and Honolulu. That last stop had to be a little fun. She earned her Doctorate of Education, Curriculum, and Instruction with a focus on equity from the University of Florida in 2019. She earned her Master of Science from OSU and a Bachelor of Science in 2005 from the University of Tulsa. So she spread that money around. In her free time, she runs, she hikes, she bikes with her husband and their rescue dog.
Always nice to love on those animals. Our next panelist is Mikhail Vaughn. He's the founder and executive director of Urban Coders Guild. This nonprofit organization is dedicated to addressing the adaptive challenges of underrepresented minorities in STEM, specifically app development by providing urban youth with coding and mobile app development, design theory and applications, and entrepreneurship training. Their goal is to create both a supply of professional app developers of color, as well as local demand for their skills. Mikhail has also currently serves as the web content developer for Tulsa Public Schools. He earned his MBA from Temple University in 2010 and his Bachelor of Business Administration with an emphasis in Spanish and international business from the University of Maryland in 2004.
I will say I've had some really good pizza just down the street from Temple, just in case anybody wants to go. I think we could help. And we're going to begin with some questions. We put together a panelist. We know you're going to have some of your own too, and some of the folks who are on with us are going to have some as well. To submit questions to panelists, you're going to click the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And Megan, why don't you start?
Okay, so the first question we're going to start with is, what do you think some of the best practices or tips to help educators ensure that their classroom is a welcoming space for all? And I honestly would like to kind of hear all of our panelists talk about that. Do we want to start with Dr. Dickens? Oh, you're muted.
You actually cut out on the last part of the question, so would you mind saying that last part one more time?
Absolutely. What do you think some of the best practices or tips to help educators ensure that their classroom is a welcoming space for all?
Okay, so a few suggestions that the research will put out there would be the students really need to see themselves in the curriculum. So that's normally the one that I look at readily. And for example, if presuming we're on a site, then we want to be able to see scientists, we want to be able to see mathematicians in the books, in the role models that we put out there for the students, whether we have to invite people from the community who can demonstrate how they are using the theory skills that we're teaching, or can make it seem like something that the student can become. So it's really important for the teachers to make sure that students see themselves in what they're learning. And that can unfold in many ways. So a lot of times people will say, well, I can't find a textbook that provides all of the diversity that students should be able to see. Well, if there is no textbook, then I will just say, like Toni Morrison has always said, if you can't find the book that you want, then you need to write the book yourself. So I would say we need to write the books for our students by creating those images that they see, exposing them to those community members who represent who they are, putting it up on the wall. A picture, maybe a picture of someone who is significant, who visited the year before or 5 years before, who graduated from the school, so that they can see that people have gone through the system and represent multiple types of backgrounds. The other thing would be, often we miss out on the native languages sometimes if we're talking about diversity of language. Sometimes students who don't master the language that we're predominantly using in the classroom, they're falling behind because we're not allowing them to express what they're saying in some manner within their documented language, and then have someone within their languages and be able to express the writing and at least be able to understand if maybe this is actually a gifted thinker, and the only or primary barrier is that the student is not able to communicate in the language we're accustomed to. So I'm going to sort of broadly speak of language, not just as a spoken one of, for example, Spanish or an Asian descent language, or some specific language that we may think of. I'm even going to speak of it in the sense of the language of just expression, drawing. It's not actually a language, but sometimes we have people who think differently. They don't use words. I'm an English teacher, so I'm accustomed to students using linguistics. And probably by my answer, I'm probably talking too long, but that represents that I'm used to using language, words, to connect ideas. Well, some students will think in terms of a picture that they draw, a picture that they take a picture and then they talk about the picture. Some students will think in terms of music or in terms of a song. They will be able to put it together, in a concept together in that way. They may need to talk about science or math and how it relates to cooking and how it affects the chemistry of making bread or other manners that makes it much more accessible to them, that we need to integrate it into the classroom rather than just presuming that the science experiment that shows the chemicals through a specific way that we're accustomed to, that may not be what they're seeing in their daily lives that actually provides more meaning. So I'm going to stop there, and I know you have several other questions.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that before we move on?
I have a couple words if we have time. I just wanted to add into a little bit of what Dr. Dickens said. There's this thing called the triangulation of evidence. So it doesn't mean that a student has to actually write it down to show evidence of learning. That we should be looking at other ways of assessing learning and looking at, can they describe the picture? Can they interpret the data? Can they talk about it? And these three things can also triangulate that a student is able to demonstrate mastery of a concept. Just back to the original question, there's one simple thing that I ask teachers to do every year, and that is to send out a survey with a list of like careers and hobbies that students might be interested in. And for every unit that I would create in science, I would take hobbies and career interests from each student so that every student was represented throughout the year, and they could actually see how those things filtered into their everyday lives and how they could use that in the future, so that they related their learning to something that was foundational to help them grow into their careers. Another thing I wanted to talk about Dr. Dickens was mentioning the native languages. When I worked in Honolulu, I worked at a school for indigenous populations. And so one of the things I did in chemistry was I worked with the Hawaiian teachers to translate things over into Alelo Hawaii so that my students would have a connection with the content in a way that they hadn't seen before in their previous science classes. So if you can find ways to tie in that language and to show that you're trying to learn it as somebody who doesn't have an experience in it, it goes a long way with building that relationships with your student and helping them feel empowered in their education.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add that there's some great points here, but a lot of times we approach education as a build it and they will come from the, Field of Dreams. But one, it's acting with intentionality. I love the idea of learning your students and incorporating their stories, their narratives into the education. That really makes the connection. That's really something I would want to drive home.
Does make sense. If they care about it, they're going to learn it more easily, aren't they? It does make great sense. All right, the second question, and this one's of great interest to me. My daughter is a grad student at Texas A&M who went there as an engineer, a National Merit Scholar, and switched to education and research because of diversity and inclusion. And what she's doing now is doing research on inclusion and equity. And this question is about equity and equality in a classroom setting. Are they the same thing? And as far as that goes, how do those terms relate to the teaching profession? I'm just going to throw that open.
Well, I will go ahead and chime in. And full transparency, majority of my background is in early childhood. So I taught kindergarten and first grade, but now I work with college students and high school students. So I've been able to apply a few different lenses. And in thinking about equity and equality, those two concepts are not the same. They sound a lot alike, and sometimes they are used interchangeably because they sound a lot alike. But equality is basically providing the same thing to every person. So everybody gets the exact same thing. And then equity is the provision of personalized resources that individuals need to achieve success. When I taught kindergarten, so bear with me, I know that not everyone's a kindergarten teacher, but I would teach my students about equity and equality, often through children's literature and stories and things like that, but would talk about, if you are on the playground and you skin your knee and you have like a bloody knee, then what you would need to like solve that bloody knee from the playground would be different from what somebody needed who had a fight with a friend and had their feelings hurt. If you were to offer a Band-Aid to the person who had gotten their feelings hurt, that would be absolutely not helpful at all to that child. And not every child needs the exact same thing to reach success, which goes back to that equity focus. In order to ensure, I'm fully convinced that teaching requires a superhuman quality in order to bring 26 individuals up to the same standard or the same level. You really have to differentiate the way that you interact with every individual because every person is so different. And you can't use the same You can't apply the same strategies to every child and expect them to learn and accomplish those objectives in the same way. You have to provide equitable instruction that's tailored to the needs of individual students. So when we talk about equity and equality, equality is where everybody gets the same thing. Equity is where the provision of resources is tailored to the needs of the individual student.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to add there, Dr. Laura I've always believed that kindergarten through the primary grade teachers, they're the ones who do the real teaching. They lay the foundation and we build on it, but without those primary grades, we're messed up. And so I have worked with professional development for years, and I have found that the college teachers, university teachers, high school teachers, they learn when they listen to how the primary grade teachers break down the lessons so that it is differentiated. The best metaphor that I have heard on the difference between equity and equality is giving everyone the same pair of shoes versus giving someone a pair of shoes that fit their feet. So equity means giving everyone the pair of shoes that fits their feet. And that's our goal in education, to give you what you need in that sense. And that metaphor has stuck with me for years. I heard it at a conference in Florida, and it has always helped me think about my students who, if they're in the snow, if they're playing a sports game, if they are just walking in the house, even a different type of shoe matters for the context of what they're doing. So we want to give students the equity in education for each subject that they're taking and for the conditions that that student brings to the subject.
Anybody else want to chime in?
I'd like to just add in that traditionally saying the word equality has been used to reinforce the status quo. So I've given every student the exact same thing. Why can't they succeed? It tends to be a reinforcement of bias and status quo that is already existent in educational systems. And we need to really focus on that word equity over equality. Equality just means I give you the same thing, just like Dr. Laura was saying. We need to really realize that there is bias in that statement by saying, well, I've given every kid the same thing.
And I would, just one more addition to that, I really hope that from a political perspective, often we say that teaching should not be political, but so I just want to make the note that every act of teaching is political because we're teaching students to think. We're teaching students to question. And the reason that I bring that up is that in a political landscape, often the sense of giving everyone the same thing comes across as we've given everyone a fair chance. And that is not the truth, because if you give everyone the same amount of funding, but some people have a higher or harder road to go through in order to get a completed education, you're not giving the student who has to do 3 years of makeup work to get caught up to everyone, you're not giving sufficient resources to get them there. So part of equity in education, in giving the students what they need, it's not the burden of just the teacher alone in the classroom. It's the burden of the principal, the colleagues who also work with those students. It's the burden of the district, the burden of the state, and the whole country to allocate the resources for what those students need.
So knowing that we need to work on some of the allocation with the resources, and I know we kind of mentioned this already, but how can we view culture, heritage, and race as resources for our educators and within the classrooms?
I guess I'll start with that one. No, I think what I hear from that question is that part of being an inclusive classroom, so it's sort of going back to just a different way of looking at the first question. Part of being an inclusive classroom and part of helping the students succeed is to focus on their strengths, to focus on what heritage, culture, community, family, all of the unique attributes that the students have brought into a classroom go quite well with the idea of asking them and searching for the strengths at the beginning of the semester. So for me, whether we're talking elementary to college, the first few weeks and all through the year, we are constantly looking for the strengths that the student has. So a very important aspect, Gloria Ladson-Billings is a person who talks about the culturally responsive pedagogy and the type of search and privileging of the culture that the students bring. So when we look at their strengths that Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about, and Geneva Gay when she talks about culturally responsive teaching, they are basically looking at the idea that the student's strength as saying, I know that my mother, my grandmother, my father, my grandfather, this is the background of the work that they have done. And so when I bring it to the classroom setting, what I want to do is figure out how can I present my science or my math in the context of the heritage of the grandparents, of the parents, of the culture where my students are coming from, so that they start to see within their cultures are the very strengths that they're trying to learn within the school system. The culture, the heritage, the families are not separate from the educational system. They embody the educational system. So it becomes unfortunate when the classroom looks like a separate entity instead of the classroom becoming the complement to what the parents have already brought to the students' lives. So a student comes in and they think that they're getting better than their parents and their grandparents. They're not getting better than those family members and their cultures. They're standing on the shoulders of their parents and their grandparents. They're benefiting from what they've already done. So we have to help the students make those connections with their cultures and with their families so that they take them back and add to them, but they don't detract from them.
Others?
Dr. Dickens, you just really hit the nail on the head there when you were talking about the importance of, families and looking at what students bring to the classroom rather than what they don't have. A one note, be cautious about the way that you speak about your students and recognizing, I think about my time working with students who had a native language other than English. And there was this emphasis on language that they didn't have. And that's the wrong way to look at this. I look at that. Rather, they're on the cusp of being bilingual and they bring so much culture and they bring so many experiences to the classroom that are so invaluable. In addition to that, and this actually goes back to the first question that was posed, and I thought it was really interesting. I think the question was like, how do you create an inviting space for all? And it wasn't just how do you create an inviting space for all students, but as teachers, you are also working very closely with parents. And so building close relationships with parents, recognizing that the other 12 hours or the other portion of the day, the students' teachers are their families, and they know them far better than you as the teacher for 1 year know them. So partnering with parents, learning from them. I always tried to approach that relationship with humility, recognizing that it was such an honor to be entrusted with this student, and the relationship with that parent for that precious window of time, that 1 year, to learn from parents about what things that they value at home, the ways that they feel about school. And so I think really connecting with families at home is critical and a vital part of the role of a teacher.
Any others before our next question? The next one's a very difficult one. And again, as my daughter is doing some sub work down at Texas A&M and in the College Station Bryan area, how do you set up to have conversations in a classroom about race and lines of differences in a classroom? And this can be so culturally significant because for what one culture to say to each other is considered okay as opposed to another culture. How do you set up that safe space? You can talk about race, you can talk about those relationships, and you can do it without offsetting the others in the classroom and marginalizing anybody. It's got to be a difficult task.
I would say involving students in the process of creating your classroom norms is going to be an extremely important piece of this. So you might ask your students the question, how do we show each other respect in the environment that we're learning in? And what tools do you need to feel respected? And kind of creating your classroom norms with those in mind helps students feel like it's a safe space to share what they actually need and a safe space to talk to others about what they need. So that just might be a simple, like a classroom way to start out and get those kids feeling like it's a safe space. And another thing I would say is making it clear that when something happens in your classroom that is biased, that is racist, that is, bigoted, that we actually do not ignore those things. I know that I've personally been in classrooms when I was growing up and those things were ignored and then it was accepted as okay. It's not ever letting those things be okay, that we talk about it, we figure it out as a class about how it doesn't align and what it does to our society when we perpetuate those things and don't call them out.
If I can add, Dr. Miller, that's a great point. Calling out problematic behaviors, problematic language, and we hear it. But on the other side, I want to say that our kids, they don't have the same level of filter that we have. They feel comfortable talking about things. And as adults, we have to not wince when we hear some of their stories, some of their narratives. We have to sometimes lean in and engage them in the conversation as opposed to shutting it down. Sometimes it's difficult for us to hear because we have different experiences. Even myself being a Black male, being in front of other Black males, there's a generational difference that I might not understand, but instead of stopping them, leaning back, sometimes they have to do a better job of leaning in. And that's something that I would encourage all of us as educators to do. Let the students lead. Of course, keeping some guidelines around the conversations. Dr. Miller said, creating a set of standards around conversation in the classroom. But again, letting the kids lead a little bit, letting them talk, letting them share their experiences and not filtering them as adults from ours.
From an early childhood perspective, and that, Mikhail, what you just said resonated so much with my thinking, and I appreciate that so much. Children's literature can serve as a gateway to conversations about race and complex concepts, but on a level that's developmentally appropriate. So like Mikhail said, kids are very aware of the world around them. In fact, on this topic, I actually, when I was in the classroom, would use a text by Todd Parr called It's Okay to Be Different. And I would actually teach about the concepts of similarity and difference and the importance of both of those things. And this is kindergarten, so you wouldn't teach this in high school, but kids are very, very aware of how, you know, their skin color is different than somebody else's skin color, or their experience might be different than somebody else's, and they're eager to talk about it. And rather than exactly what Mikhail said, shutting that down, fostering that conversation. And interestingly, since we are all about STEM, that was a lesson that I would teach that actually had, you know, math concepts at the core. So one of the first foundational math concepts is the ability to sort and classify objects. So to look at the qualities of different, you know, objects and things like that. And so I would actually kind of like merge both, like to talk about those math words. Similarity and difference are words that contribute to that concept, but then also contribute to the concept of understanding differences and similarities between the kids and between each other. So don't squelch those conversations, allow them to happen, listen, and as the teacher, preemptively plan, like what questions are you going to ask to help that conversation flow, but don't squelch it.
And I would add here that the conversation, preparing for this conversation starts at the beginning of a school term, and often starts really before you've met the students, if any letters or communications go out to parents, where they're prepared for the types of conversations, or at least how you set the norms, how you set the protocols for discussing any topic. So the first days of school will definitely focus on procedures. We'll focus on the respect of how we listen and think through a conversation. And so things that we do in terms of, we focus on the idea rather than the person. We focus on listening until the others have completed their statements. A lot of the procedures start day one. And so when we get to the topic of race or any difficult subject matter, we've already been practicing these protocols or these norms or these procedures that help the students navigate the concept because they have the procedures mastered. So often we get to the difficult topic, and that's when we want to invoke a procedure. That's when we want to invoke, let's talk about this in a fair-minded way. Well, we need to talk about everything in a fair-minded way. So don't let the topics that we're squeamish about become the time when we suddenly decide we need some balanced structure to how we present this information. The students will become accustomed to that balance process, the examination, critical thinking. They will be accustomed to critical thinking, and race should not be the first time they start talking about, or whatever the topic is, because the topic may not be race, it may be dealing with LGBTQ community, it may be dealing with religion, it may be dealing with immigration, it may be any number of topics that are touching those students in a certain way, and it's suddenly difficult for that classroom. So the protocols that we set up in the first days, first week, first month become invaluable when the topics become difficult.
Speaking of that, we have a question that was actually sent in here, and I think it plays into this really well that I think we ought to get to, and it comes from Kristen, who says, in an early childhood or elementary classroom where students are often just parroting what they hear at home, how do you address comments made by a student without disparaging that source, which is often their parents or their grandparents? And this plays exactly into what you were talking about.
Yes, and so this comes up all the time, and so Dr. Laura was talking about, she deals with it from the kindergarten. I deal with it from the adult side and the college side all the time. And even at that level, so I will admit that we have used children literature within college classrooms to also make points, but we also deal with this idea that many of our values are based on our experiences and not necessarily on whether it's right or wrong, but every time you confront someone's values, potentially you are insulting their heritage, their family, their culture. And so again, removing that idea of who is it connected with is extremely important. And so again, I'm still going to focus on the protocol of, well, how do we discuss this idea? Normally, the reason it becomes an important topic is because a classroom comment is clear that someone was disturbed by what someone said because it contradicts what they have heard or what their value system represents. So that becomes that teachable moment. So I cannot prepare for when someone is offended and they let the whole class know. I can't prepare for when it's going to happen, but I can prepare for procedures being in place so that it's not abnormal for me to stop the regular routine and say, we have a concern that we need to deal with, and we're going to learn this lesson today. We're going to talk about this lesson today. Let's just explore this topic a little more. And we focus on moving it from the person who said it and moving it from the parent, the grandparent, the family, to this is a concept that has been out for many years. And we can sometimes have the students take a moment. Why don't we get into some groups and talk about this, or you take a moment and write something or draw something about what are your thoughts? Let's get your thoughts on paper first. Let's get your thoughts out in a small group, perhaps. If we have time, we can also do some research. If students have computers, they can do a little bit of research for 5 or 10 minutes. And then we come back and find out what are some different perspectives that you've explored, that you found. We can make this a little more objective. So we need to help the students examine information from multiple perspectives of what they value, what is information that is considered commonly accepted fact, and what is based on our values and our beliefs rather than what we consider to be ethical behavior. So just helping them examine it and try to make sense of it from those multiple ways of viewing things. And then if these are multiple ways of looking at it, you are entitled to and expected to make sense of your world through what you value most. If you value religion most, if you value what the opinion of your parents are most, I just need you to be aware of it and be able to examine it from that perspective. And so if we give the students the tools to talk about something that is difficult by putting it into some form that lets them construct the meaning, then they're going to have a better opportunity of saying, this is how I see the world, and I see how you are viewing the world. I don't have to agree with it, but I can respect that you are entitled to view the world the way you are choosing to view it. So I'm not going to disrespect it. I'm going to actually respect your right to make those choices.
Anyone else?
Dr. Dickens mentioned perspective taking, and I would say teaching empathy is one of the things that is like a kindergarten skill, but I think actually teaching empathy is something that ranges the entire learning spectrum, even into adulthood. And the ability, when you're teaching kiddos that are younger, their perspective, the only perspective that they know is their own. And so starting from self and recognizing that sometimes you have to start with the kids or the students' experiences, and to understand this is how you feel when this happens to you. When somebody says something that is offensive, that's what that feeling feels like. And when you say the offensive thing, then you are creating that hurt in somebody else. And it sounds very fundamental and it sounds very basic, but it's actually quite developmental, and it takes a while to develop that quality of taking the perspective of others. Like Dr. Dickens said, building that into your practice of teaching and developing time, or having time in the classroom to develop that perspective taking. How might the words that I'm saying affect somebody else? Is really, really critical in that work, and not everybody learns that. And so as a teacher, you have this opportunity to help support that development of perspective taking and empathy, and seeing beyond just the perspective of self.
If I can add one thing, because I'm hearing some great things from Dr. Dickens and Dr. Lauda. I always want to and always try to hold space for a difference of experience, a difference of perspective. But starting from the very beginning, I want to always create a sense of belonging for all of my students. So sometimes our perspectives, our ideas conflict in such a way that someone might feel like they don't belong. And so setting up a culture within our classrooms where everyone feels like they belong, and working on empathy, building empathy, and that's something that we have to do every day until the day we die, is crucial. And then we could start to talk about the differences, but everyone has to really have that sense of belonging. I belong here. Who I am, how I show up in a space is just as valid as how someone else shows up. And so I know that brings us into conflict sometimes, but really starting from the very first time that we convene as a class, as a cohort, as a group of, as any group is critical.
Anybody else? I think everyone kind of hit on that one. So this does kind of lead into the same conversation we were having of what are some ways that we can discuss some of this in some of our other classes, especially our STEM classes, because I feel sometimes, especially with diversity, it's easier to discuss that in English classes when you're comparing it to the literature that you're reading. But what are some ways that we can promote some of this, like Dr. Lauda was saying early on, or even later within our STEM classes?
I think this, especially for me, one of the things I'm pushing out right now is that science is for all. So traditionally, science has been for those who are naturally talented or quick learning. And helping teachers realize that part of the problem we're facing today is the fruition of that mentality, to where people can't engage with data, people can't engage with scientific argumentation, that opinions are valued over fact. And so setting that up to where like science is for everyone, and allowing students to have multiple opportunities to prove that they can succeed in science, right? It's not a one shot and you're done situation. It is, I don't care how long it took you to get there, you got there. And so I'm going to give you credit for the learning that you have, not how long it took you to get there.
And I do, from an equity perspective, or primarily equity, for science and math, I think it's really important for students to see the connection to their communities and how science and math is playing out in creating inequitable circumstances for communities. If we can take water, for example, and examine how water treatment or water conditions for certain communities are often not sanitary, help them understand they can go out and they can get samples and they can use in science to determine what are some of the contaminants that are within the water in communities. And they can start to see how the science reveals inequitable practices, inequitable conditions. They can also go, I have often done in my classes, I'll have them go to the grocery store and just get some prices on the same items. Go to 3 stores, and this is the list of items that I need you to go to those 3 stores and get the prices and compare what the shopping weekly amount is going to be based on that meal preparation for the week. And when they start looking at, well, one of the things that they will often find, depending upon which communities they go to or they're assigned to go to, they will find that, well, I can't find a grocery store, but I can find a convenience store. And so, of course, the stores are going to have higher prices or have different products that may not be in the same sizes or the same nutritional value. So they start to realize the economics of equity. They start to realize the scientific inequities of health disparities that are going on in the community that they can measure. So if we can use science and math for them to find the inequity, to find them, identify, understand, and then do something about, have them write a letter to their newspaper, to a reporter, get them to come out and do something, or at least bring them to the classroom and say, what are you all working on? Highlight what they're doing so that they have an authentic experience with science and math that changes the communities that they care about. Those are some of the things that it's important, no matter what the subject is, the subject needs to allow them to bring whatever it is that they're learning in the classroom, bring it to the community to address inequities that exist.
I'm going to just pop in and add one more thing, because we have to also like tie everything into our standards, right? We can't just go off and teach whatever we want to, because that's just not the reality of the educational system. So, I mean, we also, I think some like real, if we could create some sort of database of like real things where we can put this into place, such as temperature differences in urban settings versus rural settings, and how that is exacerbating like health problems. That could be a huge unit in like an environmental science unit or in a middle school like introductory unit as their spiraling curriculum. But it's, you know, for me, I think it's so hard to help teachers in my position do all of these things, but also say you have to cover all these standards before the end of the year. So it's like, how do we find things that are very relevant and focus on equity and help them still accomplish their goals so that they won't be, you know, get reprimanded by their administrators? So how do we find that balance between what we have to do as a teacher on that end and what we need to do for equity in calling those things out? So, I mean, I would love to hear if anybody has some suggestions on that too.
I'm not sure if I can answer that directly, but maybe I can get to it a bit. And I think every moment of the school day is a critically valuable moment, and every conversation, every interaction. I teach my students so I teach a math concepts class. I teach future math teachers of early childhood. You know, you may not identify or historically, you may not have had good experiences with one of the facets of STEM, science, technology, engineering, or math, but never let the words come out of your mouth that you're not a science person, you're not a math person, you're not a tech person or engineering, because your students are always watching and they're always listening. And if you, however you identify as an individual, if your students who really honor you and love you and look up to you hear you say, I'm not that kind of a person, then it automatically casts this negative shade on that thing, and they may internalize that it's okay to say, I'm not a math person. There may have been a part of my growing up experience where I said that, but when I became a teacher, I quickly learned I have to be extremely cautious. Zaretta Hammond, who's one of my, I really admire her so much. She did a talk called Equity Through Inquiry. and I'll share it in the chat box so that you can watch it later. But she says this powerful quote, competence precedes confidence. And you know, students, that feeling of confidence, or sorry, that feeling of competence, so being able to successfully complete a task in STEM in some way, it's a really addictive experience. When you get something right and you feel like, I solved a problem, I did something really cool, I made something, that really sparks engagement, and over time creates confidence. And as I was looking at the other panel members, I thought of Mikhail, who is really doing this work at the Coders Guild, where students come to the table and they basically have a blank canvas to create, and there are multiple ways that they can succeed. And I don't want to steal his thunder by telling too much, but I think that work really embodies that competence, which yields confidence. So never will they say, I'm not a math person, because they know that they are a math person. They've been successful in engaging with math, and they've been successful in engaging with science and engineering and technology. So be cautious not to say you're not a STEM person in front of your kids. And then the second, create multiple entry points where students can feel that competence in order to develop confidence.
You know, speaking of entry points, I think it's important to ask, how do you push STEM across the normal boundaries? And by that, I mean the people who we normally see in STEM. How do you get it to students of color? How do you get it to girls? How do you, along those lines, make them all know that it's not just something they might be able to do, but it's available for them to try?
So I think we're back to, again, sort of like the first question, which is, we have to show them examples of people who are using math who look like them so that they see it as a potential. If I look at every book and I look at all of the images in a school and I hear of all of the theorems or theories related to science and math, and I'm only seeing people who don't look like me, I'm going to be an exception. Now, that can certainly define my journey as a person, but my journey is actually going to be much more helped. It's going to be better helped if I see someone who lives in my neighborhood, who lives in my city, who comes to my classroom or has a Zoom call into my classroom and makes connections for how they're doing what they're doing right now that I want to do. If I'm talking to someone who is the CEO of the Williams Corporation or One Oak, and they're telling me this is how I decided to become an engineer, and I find out this person looks exactly like me, they have the same background, and I'm going to ask them, how did you do that? What was it like? Parents want to know as well, what did you do for that person who's now 30 years old and just got a job that I want my child to have when they're 30 years old? So that is important, to put the models in the classroom. And so I think I want to remember what Dr. Miller was asking, some of the questions of what are some things that I can do to make sure that I'm adding equity in these classrooms. This is by, and not getting, going straight off the standard. I mean, that obviously we have to teach what's in the subject matter. So this is truly my doctorate area is in curriculum design. So I don't want anything, if I can't tie it to the course outcomes, I don't want it in there. So the question becomes, in the planning, am I communicating with other colleagues about maybe partnerships of doing things with those colleagues, some kind of a project that will work together for my students? Are there partners in the community who are part of these related fields that relate to science and math, where someone can come in and provide a case history of a problem that now my students can start to consider ways of solving problems that these true practitioners of what I'm dealing with in theory for learning math, learning algebra, can someone from the Corps of Engineers come in and give an example of how math is working, how they're using algebra, how they're using engineering to do the work of helping during a flood? What is it that, the school was constructed by an engineer? Not only the aesthetics of the art related to the school, but the actual foundation of the school. How did you make the basement? What is the math? What is the science of keeping the water out, or even the plants? Why are there certain plants there? What's the purpose of those from a scientific perspective of keeping out mosquitoes, of providing certain other attractions that are needed to complement the school on a very physical, biological perspective? The engineers, they can explain that, and our gardeners can explain that, because this is a form of science as well. So we just need to bring in that, incorporate those into the lesson. So it may take some brainstorming. It may take some searching for lesson plans that are already out there, because believe me, we are not the first ones to come up with these questions. And someone out there, we've been teaching too long to not have a lot of lessons that we can borrow. And as my colleagues typically say, that we're going to steal freely from other teachers, and we want them to. So we want to help the students, and we will cooperate. I think that's one thing. We're all here today because we care about education. So we would be willing to give resources. I'm asked all the time to just go into a classroom and explain how do you use writing? And so I would also be able to explain how do I use math today? How do I use algebra today? I use those in making budgets. I use those in forecasting what's going to work, what is working when I'm looking at the impact of the work in my area. So we're using that, and students need to understand that if you don't get a good foundation in science and math, you're going to be hindered in the future if you expect to be a professional.
If I could jump in, because there are some great points that I've heard from Dr. Lauda and Dr. Dickens. First off, I'm a fan, and so there's a lot of things that I'm hearing that I think that I bring to my classroom. One is the personal narrative, having someone look like my students in front of them and being able to share my story. I'm from North Tulsa. My students are from North Tulsa, West Tulsa, East Tulsa. They're Tulsa public school students. I am a product of Tulsa Public Schools. So being able to stand in front of my students, share my experiences, and have them see themselves in me is very important. And that's one of the reasons why I do what I do. Mentorships. Not every classroom, so this is number 2, not every classroom has a Mikhail standing in front of them, but there are people throughout the community who can represent what the students are or reflect who the students are. There are people of color, there are women, there are people from our Latinx community who can come and be mentors or come and be reflections of our students and their population. The third thing is STEM. Quick story, I had a group of students, some of them took to the coding like ducks in water, some of them not so much, but they all had an understanding of STEM as a generalized concept and understanding that there is a STEM ecosystem. Not everyone is going to be a coder or an engineer or a developer, but every STEM organization, STEM institution, every aspect of STEM requires project managers, you require salespeople. In fact, most big companies are mostly salespeople. So you're going to need it takes all kinds, and letting kids know that they might not be an engineer. We're going to teach them engineering. We're going to support that learning, but they might have different paths and supporting them in that.
And I know I'm one of the hosts, but I want to pop in real quick. Use social media. Use hashtags of women in STEM, women in weather. Women in STEM Wednesday is a huge thing. There's a huge following on Twitter right now of the Black and Geoscience account, and it has blown up my actual personal Twitter feed recently. Use social media, reach out to everyone. If you know a student wants to be a meteorologist, I'm biased, I admit that. Reach out to a meteorologist. If they don't want to do TV, we know other people, we know other ways. There are meteorologists across everything. There are engineers across everything. So that connection, that networking, which is part of what tonight is about, is going to be huge. If you don't know someone, I promise you know someone that knows someone. 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon for a reason. Well, I guess I'll ask the next question. This is from Michelle, that she loves all these ideas, but she is finding it challenging at times to build the classroom community virtually, which is what a lot of us are doing right now. What suggestions do our panelists have to build this community online since we aren't in person?
I am in that struggle right now as I'm navigating distance learning, teaching at the college level, recognizing that Zoom fatigue is definitely real. And for those that are 100% distance learning right now, being mindful of that. You can't just ignore it. Like, you can't say we're going to power through an hour of instruction. Like, that's just not appropriate, and you'll lose attention and things like that. But I think, gosh, as much as you can, if you can schedule one-on-one engagements to get to know your students. I know it's the beginning of the school year, and some folks had to skip or omit the meet the teacher, or had to have, you know, some sort of a distance experience. Try and make sure that you're having some one-on-one check-ins. I'm finding that it's really hard for me to remember my students' names, and normally I can pick up on them pretty quickly. But it's because I'm looking at them in a 1-inch, you know, rectangle. Get creative with the technology that you have. There's a lot of different things out there to try. I found, you know, initially I was like, it was like this, there are too many options for me. I was like, I don't know where to start. There's so many of them. So like there's like Jamboard and Poll Everywhere and like all of these different things. And so I really consulted with some, you know, an educator friend that I really trusted, like, what are you finding that works really well? Or even asking if you've been to a webinar that has like rocked and you felt really engaged and they use different technology tools in that webinar, you know, asking for help, because we're all navigating this terrain for the first time. And then just start with one. And then once you feel competent with, you know, using that one piece of technology, which actually Jamboard is the thing that I'm feeling really excited about. And I feel like I'm getting more competent and can get the voices of all of my students represented in a conversation. It really does take creativity, and there's really not a magic pill. But thinking outside of the box about how you can still learn the stories of your students and learn the preferences. If you teach older students, I had my students, you know, complete a personality profile assessment. So at least after our time together, I could go in and look at what are their preferences as, you know, in terms of personality, whatever you can do to get to know them. But again, it's challenging. So I won't say I know the answers, but that's been my journey so far.
If I could jump in, because I am actually getting ready to start a student cohort at the beginning of October. And some of the things that my instructors and I have thought through, I think they could be helpful. And feel free to question, because I am definitely open. I think they were all trying to navigate a brand new landscape. But for me, when I think about my niece, she has a closed space where she does her student learning. And so for me, I'm actually doing interviews with my students before we start. I want to take pictures of them. And so I will have their pictures on that board, so I will know their faces when I'm talking to them. And then because we're doing those interviews, that will have a certain rapport, keeping those one-on-ones, like Dr. Lauda said, I think those are important. But also going back, an old school analog method, doing introductions, letting the students lead those introductions, asking a question to the rest of the students, are a prompt so the other students are answering and engaging with each other, and doing breakout rooms from time to time where there's smaller groups of students who are building bonds, building cohorts within that virtual space. I would love at some point to be able to have those cohorts to come together in real time, in real life. However, that's not really possible or not safe at this time. But using our technology, I know Zoom, we're all on Zoom. Zoom has breakout rooms. And so being able to use what we have to get what we want.
Anyone else?
I mean, I have to throw this out there. There are some district restrictions, like at TPS, our teachers aren't allowed to use breakout rooms for safety reasons. And so that's also limiting. But I want to add, like, there are so many things out there, and make sure that you're using your synchronous time on Zoom, where students are interacting with you and each other, not you presenting information. So kind of take that flipped classroom model, let them preview material so that they're coming to you with questions, that they're coming to classroom to like puzzle piece things together with their peers, so that every time they're coming together, they're not watching, they're actually being forced to interact with each other and interact with you, so that you can kind of learn about their levels of development and draw those connections and feel like, oh, this kid's really interested in gaming. Like, how can I pull that into her curriculum that we're going to be talking about in a couple of weeks?
And I would just add that, you know, what we already know about effective teaching in terms of the student owning the process more than us presenting it to them. We simply need to figure out ways to use the current concept or platform to have them present the material. So I'm not going to repeat all that we've heard, which I think is great, but we need to figure out how to do the what we know small group work is effective, but it's only effective when the students have a specific role. They know what they have to do. So we have to define for them, when they do get to the breakout room, what this is going to look like and who's going to come back into the large room or come back to the teacher at a separate time. And I can now go and visit with those small groups about specific targeted skills, but we will still have to be intentional about how we deal with small groups, and we'll still have the large group maybe where, you know, everyone's in a large classroom and then I'm only dealing with a few in a small group at a certain time. That still is going to be how we manage, but now it's not a physical classroom. It is now an electronic one, and we still do the same things. We still have presentations. We still have students writing or writing reports or doing some kind of presentation, of even taking a quiz. Now they can respond to questions in the chat room as far as a way of, here's my question, now you raise your hand. So we can show them how to use the participant icons or emojis and use those. They may be more excited about using the emojis than we are, but at least it would be different.
As we wrap up here, there's something I'd like to point out, if I might. I love when a life imitates art and art imitates life. And for anyone looking for absolute proof, and many of you, especially you educators who have been in this for so long, you've seen these things happen. You're going to think I'm crazy, but I'd like to suggest a movie that you go watch called Spare Parts. It stars George Lopez, and it's about a community high school in Arizona who brought together 4 very unlikely young men, all undocumented immigrants, who joined a underwater robotics competition and beat MIT, Stanford, USC, and the rest of the world 3 years in a row. Very unlikely young men with specific skill sets, which is what you were talking earlier. Let them bring what they bring to the table and specialize in it. I promise you, it's a true story. If you watch it, you'll be touched and you'll be encouraged. And most of you are already encouraged, or you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. But I just like to suggest that. So as we draw to a close here, though, we want to go ahead and leave a survey link in the chat right now. So if you please take a few minutes and provide your honest feedback on the webinar. And remember, the first 100 educators will get a goodie bag. And if you don't pick it up, Megan and I get the rest of them, so you might as well go ahead and get it.
Seriously, guys, I could use a quick trip gift card. But thank you again to TD Williamson for providing the door prizes and our goodie bags, to our teachers and our other sponsors for making tonight possible. Again, those is Oklahoma Central Credit Union, Academy Sports and Outdoors, BMX Foundation, and Papa Murphy's.
Good night, everybody.
Night, y'all.